Hey everyone, it's Mr. Schwartz here with our lecture on theories of emotion. Remember, while we're going through these lecture slides, you should be completing assignment 2, which is your guided notes, at the top of which is just simply labeled emotion. So make sure you have assignment 2 open while we're going through these lecture slides so you can complete assignment 2. Okay. Now, when it comes to our experience of emotion, there are three things that happen. There's a physiological arousal, meaning a change in the body. There's a cognitive experience, meaning a thought. And then there's the experience of the emotion. So, there's a change in the body, we have a thought about that change, and we label that entire experience an emotion. When we're going through these three different theories of emotion, it's important to keep in mind, how do these theories differentiate between the order in which these three experiences happen? Does your heart pound because you are afraid? Or do you experience fear because you notice your heart is pounding? The three theories that we're going to examine are named after the people who developed them, so there's no real way of differentiating the theories based on their names, unfortunately. The first is the James Lange theory of emotion, named after two scientists, one with the last name James and one with the last name Lange, who developed this theory. They say that our experience of emotion is caused as a result of a physiological change. In other words, a stimulus causes our body to respond first, which then causes our experience of emotion. So, something is chasing us. Our body reacts before our mind does. Our heart starts pounding. And we probably have other sympathetic nervous system responses, like we start breathing heavily and digestion ceases and all the things that happen in that fight or flight moment. And then, after the fact, do we label that experience fear. And that's what we call the emotion, is the labeling of the experience. Now, there's been certain experiences done to see if a bodily change results in an emotional change. Like if they're forced to smile, they tend to experience greater happiness. The problem with this theory, or one of the problems with this theory, is that different emotions elicit similar body responses. So how can you tell that they're different? Fear, anger, love, excitement, exhilaration, all of these things produce racing heart. So how do you know, if the only thing we're looking at is the physiological change, what emotion you're experiencing? So the next theory we're going to look at is called the Cannon-Bard theory. Again, just named after the people who developed it. Their theory is that the physiological change and the cognitive interpretation occurs simultaneously when there's a physiological response. Let me say that again. Our experience of emotion occurs simultaneously with a physical response. Okay? So the James Lange theory was a cause and effect. The physiological response causes the experience of emotion in response to a stimulus. The Cannon-Bard theory says that in response to a stimulus, we experience the emotion and the physiological change at the same time. Okay? Number 3, Singer-Schachter, the two-factor theory of emotion. This theory says that our experience of emotion is caused by a simultaneous physiological response and cognitive labeling. So here, this one says that we don't actually experience emotion until we label it as such. Here we have biology and cognition interacting to essentially create the experience. This is how we answer the question, well, how do we differentiate between fear and excitement if both produce pounding heart? Well, here we have our mind, our thinking, our cognition acting as that intermediary between the physiological experience and the emotional experience. So, we're being chased, we have an experience of pounding heart, and then the cognitive label, I'm afraid, or this is dangerous, produces the emotion of fear. Because you can be playing, I don't know, when you were younger, playing tag, or something, a game with your friends. You're being chased, your heart's pounding, but the cognitive label isn't I'm afraid, it's I'm excited, I'm having fun. And so you experience the emotion very differently. So that's the Singer-Schachter two-factor theory. And here again are the three theories simply laid out in front of you. James Lange, cause and effect. Cannon-Bard, simultaneous. Schachter-Singer, two factors with the cognition acting as the second factor that produces the experience of emotion. Any questions? Haha, joking. Email me if you do, though. mrschwartz42@gmail.com. Okay, now, those are the three different theories of how we experience emotion, but emotion is such an incredibly complex phenomenon that there's so much more to look at and think about when we're talking about emotion, okay? One thing to look at is called the opponent process theory of emotion. This is essentially the same thing as a withdrawal effect. After a very intense emotion is experienced for a prolonged period of time, its opposite will replace it. There's a high, and then there's a low. There's a peak, and then there's a valley. Opponent process. There's also all of these really interesting phenomena in how we actually experience emotion. The first is the two-track brain. We should be on page 2 now of assignment 2, our guided notes, at the top of which you'll follow along. You'll see two-track brain. This is, again, essentially the fight or flight response. When fear is involved, the amygdala is activated. So we're not going through the same neurological processes in which we typically evaluate situations. Fear sort of takes a shortcut straight to the amygdala because we need to react immediately. In the fight or flight response, we're acting before we're assessing what's happening. We're running before we know what it is we're running from. Maybe some of you have experienced that before. The spillover effect. Emotions from one event can transfer over to a subsequent event. This was this kind of silly experiment where they did a windy bridge dating experiment where they would have people walk across a bridge, and at the end of it, someone would ask or offer their phone number. And on windy days, when the excitement of crossing the bridge was elevated because there was some element of, maybe fear or danger, people were more likely to accept the phone number because they were already excited. Something called adaptation level phenomenon. We judge our current state based on previous personal experiences. This happens, if you remember back to the unit on perception, the idea of thresholds when it comes to perception, or differentiating when in different perceptual phenomena. This is very similar, only now we're talking about emotion instead of perception. Counter to that is the idea of relative deprivation. We judge our current state in comparison to others. So we evaluate our emotion in relation to somebody else's situation, which is kind of dangerous. We should learn not to compare ourselves to others. Here's a old Persian aphorism. I cried because I had no shoes until I met a man who had no feet. So that's certainly something to think about. Catharsis. So often, it's a word that's used pretty commonly. It means essentially to release emotion. through action or fantasy. Keep that in mind. It doesn't have to necessarily be physical. However, there's questions as to whether or not catharsis is effective or whether it breeds more anger, which research actually shows that it, in fact, it does. The autonomic nervous system. This is the physiological arousal that is caused in those fight or flight situations. Okay, so remember we talked before about the two-track brain activating the amygdala. When that happens, your body is going to respond accordingly. Dilated pupils for increased vision. Skin is perspiring because you need to keep yourself cool because you're going to be doing some hard work, you know, to run, to fight, whatever you need to do to survive. Your heartbeat starts pounding like crazy because you need to pump all that blood to all of your limbs so that you can use them to run, to fight, to climb, to get away, to stay alive. Understand that these things in our brain, these things go back hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of evolution. So what our long distant ancestors were dealing with was being in the wild and being preyed upon by other animals. And some people in the world still experience being preyed upon by animals, and a lot of people in cities experience a similar sense of arousal and fear and danger, but typically from other people. There are some gender differences when it comes to experience of emotion. Please keep in mind that anytime we talk about gender differences in psychology or sociology, we have to keep in mind that we cannot really tell the degree to which these gender differences are purely biological and the degree to which they are influenced by society and culture. Are they inherent or are they constructed? That's always going to be the debate. And I don't believe there is an answer to the question. I think the point is that we have to recognize that we cannot ever really differentiate, or rather, we cannot ever really break it down and know for sure what percentage is influenced by biology and what percentage is influenced by sociology. There is an interactive effect between the two. So here are the gender differences. Women tend to be able to read emotional cues better. It would be interesting if we go back and look at the emotional intelligence quiz that you all completed for assignment 1, if we could tally the results, and maybe we'd see differences between the men in the class and the women in the class. Okay, express empathy and happiness more, but express anger less. Now again, is that a result of biology and genetics, or is that a result of social roles and the way that women have learned how to behave in comparison to men? I don't have an answer. I don't know. It's something to think about. All right, emotional expression. People more speedily detect an angry face than a happy one. Think about why that might be. Who poses the bigger threat? Generally speaking, the anger is going to be a bigger threat to you than your experience of seeing somebody who looks happy. Universal expressions. I'm so fascinated by this phenomenon. I mentioned it in video 1. Infants come equipped with 7 naturally occurring emotions that are culturally universal. The 7 are joy, anger, interest, disgust, surprise, sadness, and fear. Children express these even if they're blind and they haven't seen any facial expressions before. So these are inherent. These are genetic. This is nature. This is also one of the reasons why it's amazing how much can be communicated between people who don't speak the same language, because your intent and your emotion is conveyed simply through your facial expression, which you're not controlling. Emotional motivation is the idea that the person with less power is more motivated to read the emotional cues of the person with more power. Well, again, I think this has to do with threat. The person with more power is more potentially dangerous to the person with less power. Happiness. It's correlated with a lot of other personality traits and also a lot of behaviors that people can do to support a feeling of happiness. Now, correlation doesn't equal causation, obviously, so we don't really know. Does that mean that, say, sleeping well makes you happy, or does it mean that happy people sleep better? I like to think that it's bidirectional, that it works both ways. That if you're not feeling happy, it is important to think optimistically, to get good sleep, to do work that is engaging your skills, and most importantly, to exercise. It's one thing I'm struggling with during this quarantine is exercise. Let's see. Lastly, I think fear and anger. Okay. Fear is adaptive. It's necessary. It prepares our bodies to flee from danger. It can be learned from observing others. It can be learned from direct experience. You can learn not to touch a hot stove by touching it, or you can learn not to touch a hot stove by watching somebody else touch it. Certain things, interestingly, we react to more quickly than others. Snakes, spiders, heights, things that were more likely to kill us when we were living essentially in the trees and amongst other animals. And in case it doesn't need to be stated, dinosaurs did not live at the same time as cavemen. That's a joke. The image is a joke. What I said is serious. Again, some gender differences and experiences of anger. Are these learned or are they inborn? We don't really know. The best response to anger seems to be waiting or engaging in a relaxing behavior. The survey that you took about stress was from an organization that encourages and facilitates practices of mindfulness. Mindfulness is one way to help yourself just wait on that emotion before you react. So that's something that y'all can look into more if you wanted. All right, that concludes our PowerPoint lecture. You should now be completed with assignment 1 and assignment 2, having watched video 1 and video 2. The next step is to watch video 3 and then complete assignment 3. All right, I will see you over